The environmental impact statement that I'm going to be doing an analysis of is the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary, conducted by NOAA. To get into a summary of what this project is, it would increase the location-specific regulations on activities within the sanctuary. It would introduce an updated ecosystem-based management strategy instead of only focusing on humpback whales, and it would increase the area that is under protection. Right here in red is where the boundary currently lies in Hawaii, and the areas you can see in yellow, they're a little small, I do apologize. Like up here, all these yellow areas are the boundary that will be increased by the project. Alright, to continue the project summary, it was conducted by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is underneath the U.S. Department of Commerce. The 5-year budget for this project is $24 million, and this includes all employment under the sanctuary, as well as mitigation and implementing the project. The AIS is just under 500 pages, and it lists 4 various alternatives, including the no action alternative, and this assessment was done under NEPA. I thought it would be helpful to include a quick timeline of the entire history of this project to give some background. It was not started in the 1970s, but policies affecting it were put into place in the 1970s, such as the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. Title III of this act is what allows the Department of Commerce to designate areas of the ocean as sanctuaries, which is what allows them to regulate the activities that can go on there and prevent fishing there. And then next, in 1992, this is when the original Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale Sanctuary was put into place. Later, this would be revised in 2002, but it is now under revision again, which is what this EIS is all about. Then in 2009, the sanctuary began to hold public meetings to see where it could improve before the official scoping process began. And then that process began in 2010. For 90 days, there were 10 separate hearings held across the islands, and they received over 12,000 public comments that all had to be responded to. And then in 2010, the sanctuary identified the 9 most important issues out of 11 issues identified, and then groups within that sanctuary were assigned to assess each of these issues and also just get some background baseline data on them. And then in 2015, the official EIS statement was released, and immediately after that, there were another 10 public hearings held in the same locations as before. To go over the methodology of this, the impacts of the project were categorized as either part of the biophysical environment or the human environment. So the analysis is primarily concerned with the human environment impact, since this is looking at the SIA component. The human environment category was divided into 9 subcategories with specific methods for determining what the impacts would be, since they all had specific needs. And the EIS ultimately recommended the third alternative. Although I don't want to go into detail about all the alternatives because they are fairly similar, I will go into detail about the one that they recommended. This one would change the sanctuary from just focusing on humpback whale conservation to being an ecosystem-based management plan. This would mean that any keystone species that significantly impacts the ecosystem in coastal waters around Hawaii would be regulated underneath this sanctuary. The proposed alternative would also change the name to the Hawaiian Islands National Marine Sanctuary instead of the Hawaiian Islands National Humpback Whale Sanctuary. Specific regulations will be put into place in Maunui, Penguin Bank, and Mauna Loa. These regulations include prohibitions against taking marine species, using explosives, altering submerged land, and introducing non-native species to the area. Other activities included altering any signs in the area and really just anything that would harm the ecosystem. And lastly, this alternative would increase the sanctuary's border in 4 different locations. Once again, we don't need to go into detail about each location individually, but I just wanted to point out some differences between the border expansion. On this one here, you can see that this blue line right here was the original border, and it would be expanded to this orange-yellow border, just to expand the protective area, because they found that with migration and the size of the coastal reefs, they were not able to cover all the areas that needed protecting. This purple area is an area that under this plan would have fishing restricted, so you could not fish in this area anymore. And then this is a proposed naval base. This is the second change to the border out of 4 of them. And as you can see on this map, it is not changing it around the entire island. You can see up here that it's only this small section, and it is only increasing the border by a couple miles, so not as significant of a change, but there were some important species in this area that the sanctuary felt needed protecting as well. The lead responsible official for this project is Russell Callender. He is the assistant administrator under NOAA, and also Malia Chow, who is the sanctuary official who works for the sanctuary at the time, but is now currently chief of the Pacific Islands Regional Office of NOAA. To the right here are other writers and editors of this EIS. However, their qualifications were not listed, and it would take me a very long time to find them for everyone on this list, so I thought I would just share all of the authors. Now that I've given some background and some history to the need for this EIS and what exactly it will do, I would like to get into the analysis. And first of all, I've already identified the assessing qualifications. However, this is my opinion on them. Like I said, Russell Callender is the responsible official for the project. He has extensive research experience, and I would absolutely say he's qualified. I would say Malia Chow is also qualified, considering that she is the chief of a NOAA branch. Unfortunately, this project did not have a social scientist at all, or a psychologist, or anyone with experience in that area. Obviously, I do think this project is more so focused on environmental impacts. However, I definitely think it's still important to have, which is why I gave this part of the assessment an 8 out of 10, just because I feel like a social scientist was needed. When it comes to data collection, there was a lot of collaboration and gathering information from other sources. I think especially since the affected area is the entire state of Hawaii, it is difficult to conduct research in such a short amount of time. So some of their sources for social factors came from the U.S. Census, the Hawaii State Department of Labor, and Commercial Marine Landing Summary Trend Report. Then environmental baseline data was compiled using past reports from the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary, NOAA, and the Coastal Geology Group. You can see that in this corner here. This is talking about the identification of coral habitat types, especially within the affected area, and this was done by NOAA using satellite imagery. NOAA also collaborated with institutes such as Save Our Seas to send researchers to record all observed marine life within the affected locations. Unfortunately, the EIS did not use a comparative community to accurately predict social impacts. Since this is such a large area, and since it is already changing a project already put into place and it's not proposing a new project, I believe this is the reasons this was not done. However, I think it absolutely would have been helpful to get to compare these social impacts to that of a comparative community, especially to better predict what could happen from this. So unfortunately, I did have to give this part of the assessment a 0 out of 10. Where the EIS lacked in comparative community, I think they made up for in how intensive their public scoping and involvement process was. Like I said before, the very first public scoping period was in August 2010, and during this period there were 10 separate hearings held all across Hawaii. And for those who could not attend public meetings, written comments were available as well. And I also mentioned this before, but there were over 12,000 public comments. And then following the scoping period, assessors considered all public comments and addressed the eliminated alternatives in the EIS. Some of these included getting rid of the sanctuary altogether and also focusing on specific species. However, NOAA came back and said that an ecosystem-based approach would make it so they don't have to focus on a specific species and they can look at the ecosystem as a whole, and they felt that that would be more effective. And then from April to May of 2015, public hearings were held once again after the EIS was made available. So I scored the public scoping and involvement category in 9 out of 10 because I do think they tried to make this accessible as possible, and I do think they addressed most, if not all, public concerns. Some of the uncovered social impacts that the EIS identified were honestly pretty positive. To address environmental justice, the EIS stated that the proposed action and alternatives described in this document would not result in any disproportionate negative impacts on environmental justice populations. Minority and low-income populations may benefit from place-based planning efforts that seek to integrate communities into sanctuary management planning. Obviously, them not having a social scientist on this project, I would hope that this is true, and having so much public involvement, I would still hope that this is true. However, I do think this information would be a little bit more sound and maybe accurate predictions if they were to have someone in the social science field. When it comes to marine traffic, boats and other vessels that travel through the sanctuary protected areas would have to follow proposed regulations. However, commercial harbors will not be affected as they are not included in the protected areas. There are 6 commercial harbors in Hawaii, and none of them are in the protected areas, so this is only referring to traveling through them. It is not putting any limit on commercial harbors already in these locations. As for children, the EIS claims that the proposed project would not have any implications toward children's health. And also tourism is something that I personally thought would be affected by this project, since it does prohibit taking any animals out of these areas or releasing any animals into these areas, and also altering any land that is underwater in these areas. However, in the EIS, it said that tourism is not thought to be significantly impacted as the protected areas are already in place and the proposed action would just expand their borders. Something else that the EIS mentioned is that there are some tourist attractions that will actually do education, and they will do whale sightings from a distance, and they help teach people about some of the environmental harms of tourism, which I thought was super cool. Moving on to mitigation and monitoring. The EIS unfortunately did not include a mitigation section. I think this is because they ultimately decided that there weren't necessarily any significant social impacts, which I'm not sure is 100% true. I think this would have been more accurate, once again, if they had a social scientist on the project. If they were going to consider any mitigation strategies. I thought maybe if there were affected fishermen or commercial harbors or profits lost by limited tourism to these areas, that maybe the NOAA could subsidize this and give some money back to people who would lose their jobs as a result of this. That's just one idea, though. I know that would get expensive, so I'm not sure if that would actually pass. As for management, there are 4 action plans in place listed in the EIS to ensure effective management of this action. They include operational foundation, compliance and enforcement, emergency preparedness and damage assessment, and assessing progress. People within the sanctuaries are assigned to each of these categories in order to just make sure it goes as planned and ensure that nothing falls short of success. Overall, for this EIS, I did give them an A minus. I know there were definitely some details that could have been more in depth. I think they would have been more in depth had this been the first introduction of the sanctuary. I think there are some gray areas since it is just altering something already in place. However, when taking all 6 principles of SIA into account, I do still think they met all of these. Regardless of if they needed a little bit more detail, I still think this EIS was accessible to the community. I think it was easy to read, and I think it was in depth for what the project was. Thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and I'm excited to see your questions.